There was a thermos on the fence rail the morning after it happened. Same rail I'd set it on for 11 years, give or take. Same northwest corner of the outer perimeter fence where the gravel access road bent toward the transformer yard. I'd set it there at the start of every shift, because Darlene had started that habit before I did, and I'd kept it after she was gone, because stopping felt like losing something else, and I'd already lost enough. I want to say up front that I am not someone who deals in things I can't account for. 31 years running instrument panels, reading gauges, logging flow rates to 3 decimal places. You learn to trust what the numbers say and to be suspicious of everything else, including yourself. So I've been careful about what I've told people since that night in October, and I've been careful about what I've told myself. But I've been thinking lately that careful can turn into a kind of hiding, and I'm tired of hiding it. To understand what was waiting at that fence rail, I need to go back about 6 nights before, to the beginning of the stretch that ended it. The Ridgeback facility sat at roughly 2,400 feet in the Cascade foothills, 14 miles on a 2-lane road from the nearest town, which was itself not much of a town. The station ran on a skeleton night crew during the fall and winter months, which in practice meant 1 operator on from 6 in the evening until 6 the next morning, with a second man available by radio in case something tripped. That second man, Ray, lived down at the bottom of the grade and could be at the gate in about 25 minutes if conditions were right, and 40 if they weren't. I had been the primary night operator for 11 years. Before that, I'd done afternoon shifts, and before that, I'd come up through maintenance, cleaning debris screens and painting penstock flanges with the kind of careful attention that apparently convinced someone I was worth training on the turbine controls. I didn't mind the night shifts. I'd grown up farming on a flat country spread in eastern Washington, moved west for work in my late 20s, and settled into a life where the hours of darkness felt familiar, felt like the part of the day when the land could think. Darlene used to say I was a night country person, whatever that meant. She said it like it was a type, like it was something you either were or you weren't. She had been dead for 1.5 years when the October in question came around. Darlene's illness had gone fast, as those things sometimes do, and her death had left the apartment we'd rented in town feeling about twice as large as it was. I'd started bringing Hatch to the station with me on nights, which was technically against policy, and which Ray had agreed to overlook as long as Hatch stayed out of the control room during official inspections. Hatch was 11 years old that October, a border collie going grey around the muzzle, and he understood the station's rhythms as well as I did. He slept near the heater during the cold watches, and roused himself for the perimeter walk at midnight, without being prompted. The other thing I'd kept going was the thermos. Darlene had started leaving it for me early on, the first winter after I'd moved to nights, when she'd figured out that my energy dipped badly around 3 in the morning, and that station coffee was terrible enough to constitute a hazard. She'd bring the thermos herself sometimes, leave it hooked on the northwest fence rail outside the main gate, knock twice on the chain link, and be back in the car and gone before I'd crossed the yard to retrieve it. That was her particular brand of affection, practical and a little teasing, never lingering where she might be thanked. After she could no longer make the drive, she'd leave the thermos ready on the kitchen counter before I left for work, and I'd carry it up myself and set it on the rail the same way, and we'd pretend together that the arrangement was the same as it had been. After she died, I still filled the thermos at home before every shift. I still set it on the rail when I arrived. I picked it up on the first perimeter walk of the night, usually around 7, when the temperature had dropped enough that the coffee was already cooling. I knew how it looked. I knew it looked like a man who hadn't found his footing yet. I didn't argue with that. I just kept doing it. My son Clifton had said something about it the last time we'd spoken, which had been at Darlene's service 14 months before. He hadn't been unkind about it, or not intentionally, but he'd made a sound when I mentioned keeping the ritual, a small, skeptical sound, and I'd felt something close up in my chest that hadn't fully opened since. We'd exchanged a few brief messages after that, the kind where someone asks how you're doing, and you say fine without either party believing it. And then, even those had stopped somewhere around the previous March. His number was still in my phone. I scrolled past it sometimes on late nights when the gauges were quiet and there was nothing to log, and the thought of dialing it sat in my chest like a piece of cold iron. If I'm being honest, which is the whole point of telling this at all, I'd started to prefer the solitude. Not in the way people mean when they say they're introverted or need recharging. I mean, I had started to mistake the solitude for safety, to arrange my life so that nothing could get in and nothing could get out. And the night shifts and the empty roads and the 14 miles of distance from town had made that arrangement very easy to maintain. If you've worked a job where the quieter things get, the more you need to pay attention, you know how the body learns to read silence. 31 years of night shifts teach you the ambient sound of a functioning station in the way your childhood teaches you the ambient sound of your own house at 3 in the morning. The hum of the generator room, which sat at a particular frequency, around 42 hertz on a good night, with a minor harmonic when the load was heavy. The tick of the cooling pipes in the relay building after the day's temperature had worked its way through the metal. The rush of the tail race channel 30 yards below the fence. Always there, always about the same pitch, changing only when the snowmelt ran high in spring. You learned to hear all of that as one composite sound, a single texture, and you learned that when any part of that texture shifted, your body knew before your brain caught up. The first night the generator room went quiet in a way it hadn't before. I was on the second perimeter walk, a little after midnight on the first night of that 6-night stretch. Not silent exactly. The hum was still there, but something in the upper register of the ambient sound had dropped out, the way a conversation in an adjacent room will sometimes stop mid-sentence and leave a shape of quiet where the voices had been. Hatch lifted his head from the gravel path before I'd consciously registered the change. He didn't growl, didn't stand. He just raised his head toward the outer fence, toward the tree line 10 feet beyond it, and held. I stood there for a moment with my flashlight aimed at the gravel and listened. Nothing was moving in the trees. No branch, no bird, flushing in the dark. The underbrush east of the fence was heavy with second-growth hemlock and some Douglas fir that had come up since the last timber cut, so thick in places that even strong wind didn't move the lower branches much. On a still October night at 2,400 feet, that tree line was as close to absolute dark as the terrain produced. The security lights covered the yard and the near fence, but they stopped at the chain link, and beyond that was the kind of dark you navigate by having looked at it long enough to know its shapes. I didn't see anything. Hatch held his posture for another 20 seconds or so, then lowered his head and walked to my boot and leaned against my shin the way he did when he wanted to keep moving. We finished the walk. I put it down to a temperature change. Cold fronts out of the north could do unusual things to ambient sound in that valley, particularly when the first hard frosts began pulling moisture out of the vegetation and the air took on a different density. I'd seen it enough to have a working theory. I wrote it in the log as atmospheric anomaly, which was my standard notation for things that weren't the gauge's concern, and I got back to work. The second night, the same stillness arrived around 11:30, and this time Hatch was already on his feet before I noticed it, standing at the inside of the outer fence with his nose through the chain link and his tail carrying low. Not tucked, just low, the way he held it when he was paying attention to something particular. He was 11 years old and his hips gave him trouble on cold mornings, and I'd never once seen him move to the fence during a night shift without a clear reason. Deer would come through the adjacent Forest Service land sometimes, and he'd track their passage with a kind of professional interest, nose working, but he'd stay at my heel rather than move ahead. This was different. He'd move to the fence on his own, which was not a thing he did. I crossed the yard and stood beside him and aimed my light into the trees. The beam carried about 30 feet into the firs before the growth swallowed it. I held the light steady, moved it left, moved it right. Nothing broke the tree trunks. No eye shine, which was what I was looking for. The retro reflection that deer and coyotes and cats all gave you if you caught them right. The beam came back from the fence wire and the nearest tree bark, and nothing else. I told myself it was a bear. We had black bears in the upper watershed, had always had them, and they moved through the Forest Service land on their late autumn feeding rounds, with enough silence to unsettle even experienced woodsmen. I'd come face to face with a bear at the outer fence twice in 11 years, both times near the transformer yard where the vegetation thinned, and Hatch had reacted both times the same way, nose up, body forward, not aggressive, but attentive. This felt similar enough that I filed it under that category and came back in for the midnight log entry. The third night, I walked the perimeter at 11 and found nothing. The ambient sound stayed level. Hatch stayed at my heel. I almost convinced myself I'd been responding to exhaustion and working myself up over nothing. 3 consecutive nights on a shift that ran midnight to noon, then back again at 6, accumulated a particular kind of fatigue, the kind that could make coincidences feel deliberate. Then came the 4th night. I went out for the 7 o'clock walk, the first of the night, thermos already set on the northwest rail the way I always did it. The weather had sharpened since the previous evening, a hard October cold pressing down from the north that had put frost on the transformer housings by the time I arrived at 6. Hatch moved a little stiffly when we came out of the control room, his hip trouble slowing his first steps the way cold mornings did, but he settled into the walk without complaint. He came alert at the northwest corner 40 feet before we reached the rail. Not a sudden alert, the kind that means danger. A gradual one, the kind that means something is there. His pace slowed, his nose lifted, and he angled himself toward the fence without pulling ahead of me, keeping pace but orienting. By the time we reached the thermos, I had my light on the tree line without having made a conscious decision to raise it. There was a track in the frost. It was on the outer side of the fence, in a flat patch of bare soil, just beyond the gravel that edged the perimeter path, soil that the morning frost had stiffened. The track faced the fence. It was a single impression, the toe end toward the wire, and I stood there with my light on it for a long time before I crouched down and measured it with my hand, then with my boot. My boot is a size 11, which runs a shade under 12 inches from heel to toe. The impression in the soil was roughly 16 inches, broad across the ball in a way no black bear's track was broad, the toe marks separate and distinct. I pressed my palm flat beside it, and my hand covered slightly less than half the width. I got up and looked at the tree line. Nothing moved. I walked the rest of the perimeter without finding a second track. The soil on the north and east sides of the fence was either gravel or dense root mat, not frost receptive the same way, and I couldn't tell how far whatever had left that track had moved along the fence before or after. I went back to the northwest corner twice more that night. The track sat there both times. Unambiguous, not growing any easier to explain. A bear track, even an unusually large black bear, has a distinct arc across the ball, a thumbed width that comes from the anatomy of the foot, and the toes don't separate cleanly at the frost-stiffened edge of an impression. This track had none of that. I knew bear tracks. I'd been looking at bear tracks in Pacific Northwest soil since I was old enough to crouch down and look. What I was looking at was not a bear track. I told myself there were other explanations. Mountain lion tracks can distort in certain soil conditions, and I'd seen a cougar in the upper drainage 2 years back, large for the region. I told myself that. I wrote it in the log as large carnivore, possible cougar, and I sat with that for the rest of the shift. By the time Ray came up the grade in his truck at 6 in the morning and took over at the panel, I'd decided I believed it, or decided I would act like I believed it, which is sometimes the same thing. The fifth night, the pine cones. I'd done the 7 o'clock walk, retrieved the thermos, finished the first cup before I reached the east side of the fence. Hatch was moving well that night, the cold having relented 2 degrees from the previous shift, and he stayed close and easy, the kind of walk where everything seemed ordinary. I came around to the northwest corner on the return loop and aimed my flashlight down the fence out of habit, the same habit I'd built over the previous 4 nights. There were 9 pine cones arranged at the base of the fence post nearest the rail, not scattered, not in the disorganized scatter you get from wind or small animal movement. Arranged in 3 rows of 3, each cone oriented with the base pointing toward the post, a deliberate geometry, spaced at intervals too consistent to be accidental. I stood over them for a long time and did not crouch down. I didn't want to disturb them. I couldn't have told you why at the time. The reluctance felt more like respect than caution, but I held myself back. If you're finding this for the first time and want to stay with it, I'd ask you to sit with this part for a moment, because this was the moment where my ordinary explanations ran out and what came in their place was not a theory. It was just a tension. I want that to mean something before we keep going. I walked the remaining perimeter and came back to the northwest corner 4 times that night. The arrangement stayed. No wind lifted the cones. No nocturnal animal scattered them. I counted them each time. 9, every count, in 3 rows in the same orientation. On the last pass, I got down close with my flashlight and looked at the soil around the post for another track. The ground was drier there than it had been the previous night, and I found no clear impression, only a slight compression in the needle duff at the base of the post that could have been a footfall and could have been settling. Wind, I told myself on the first count. An updraft moving through the gap between the generator building and the relay house could create a channeled effect, could theoretically arrange light objects in a pattern if conditions were right. I knew, sitting with that theory for the 40 minutes between the 3rd and 4th checks, that I didn't believe it. You don't carry a theory for 40 minutes the way I carried that one unless you've already felt it fail and you're looking for somewhere to set it down. I told Ray about the pine cones in the morning when he came up the grade. I kept my voice flat. I told him I'd found an arrangement at the northwest post and couldn't account for it. Gave him the description. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether he needs to say something carefully. Probably a pack rat, he said. 9 cones in 3 rows, I said. He looked at me again. Could have been a pack rat, he said, and left it there, and I let him, because the alternative to leaving it was a conversation neither of us wanted to have standing in the cold at 6 in the morning. The 6th night, which was the last night of that rotation, I arrived at the station a few minutes before 6, the way I always did, parked the truck, got Hatch out of the back seat with the soft noise I made that meant we were there, and went inside to start the shift log and check the turbine status board. Everything was nominal. Flow rate steady, no fault codes, the head pond level exactly where the afternoon crew had left it. I filled my mug from the station kettle, poured the good coffee from the thermos into my mug, and left the thermos full for later, the way I sometimes did when I wanted to pace it through the night. I set the thermos on the northwest rail at 6:20, earlier than usual. The evening was clear and very cold, 29 degrees by the outdoor thermometer on the generator building wall. the sky fully dark by 4:30 at that latitude and that time of October, and showing stars through a thin overcast. The trees were holding what little light the security system gave them, which was mostly the orange cast of the sodium vapor fixture above the main gate. And beyond the fence, they were the shapes I'd looked at for 11 years. Nothing remarkable. Nothing changed. I did the 7 o'clock walk early, around 6:45, moving quickly to generate warmth against the cold. Hatch moved well in the cold that night, his hip trouble minimal, and he stayed close through the east and south sides without incident. When we rounded to the north side and came parallel to the tree line at close range, he began to slow, not stop, just reduce his pace, as though walking through deeper water. His ears, which normally tracked independently, both came forward and stayed forward. His tail dropped to the neutral horizontal position he held when he was working through something his senses were telling him mattered. I slowed with him. I had my flashlight on the tree line and my other hand resting on the fence wire, feeling the cold of it through my glove. Something was there. I didn't see it first. I felt the stillness first, the way I'd learned to read the station's ambient silence, except this was outside the fence, and it was not mechanical. The birds that ordinarily moved and called in the upper branches of the hemlocks at dusk, the small kinglets and juncos that wintered in those trees, had gone completely silent. Not gradually. The ambient sound of the forest had a particular texture in the early evening. Small movements and calls and the creak of branches, and that texture was absent. The forest was holding its breath. Hatch sat down at my left foot. He sat the way he sat when he was completely settled, weight back, chest up, not a trace of tension in his body. In 11 years of watching him, he sat that way when he felt safe and interested. Not passive, interested. It was the most specific thing he could have told me. I kept my flashlight on the tree line and moved it left, slowly, walking the beam across the dark shapes of the trees. At 30 feet out, the beam started losing coherence in the fir trunks. At about 40 feet, there was a gap between two large hemlocks that opened onto a small draw in the terrain, a slight depression where deer sometimes bedded in the late afternoon. And as my beam moved across that gap, it caught the edge of something that was not a tree trunk. It was darker than the trees, somehow, though the trees were already dark. It was still in the way that large things are still when they have chosen to be still, not the stillness of an inanimate object, but the stillness of attention, a held position, a watching. The shape was high. That was what registered first, and it registered physically in my chest. Not fear, but something adjacent to it, the body recalibrating what it had assumed about the space in front of it. Whatever I was seeing, the upper reach of it was at the level I'd expect the first live branches of a mature fir to begin, which put it well above where a deer or elk would stand. And it was not a tree. My beam held the gap for a count of 4 or 5. The shape was there, and then, without any movement I could track, without any sound, it was simply no longer in the gap. Not gone exactly. More like it had decided not to be seen any further and had made that decision effective without effort. The gap between the hemlocks was just a gap again. Hatch had not moved. I stood at the fence for a long time. I want to be honest about what happened next in my thinking because the temptation was to reach for one more explanation, and I knew it, and I stayed with the knowing for a while instead. I'd explained the quiet as temperature change. I'd explained the track as a cougar. I'd let Ray explain the pine cones as a pack rat. Each explanation had worked for about as long as it took to examine it closely, and then it had stopped working. And I'd picked up the next one and hoped it would hold longer. Standing at the fence in the October dark with Hatch sitting calm at my boot, I ran through the inventory of what I had left. and I came up empty. I had been emptying that inventory for 5 nights. I was out. I finished the perimeter walk and went inside and logged the readings and sat at the panel desk with my hands on the logbook without writing anything in it for about 20 minutes. Hatch went to his blanket by the heater and circled twice, and lay down and put his chin on his paws and watched me. At 11:30, I went out for the second walk. The night had gotten colder. The overcast had cleared and the stars were dense and blue-white, the kind of sky that comes with hard radiative cooling, and the frost on the chain link caught the security light and gave the fence a faint silver line against the dark beyond it. My breath moved in front of me in small clouds. I came around the south side, across the access road, up the west side toward the northwest corner, and when I was still 30 feet from the fence post, I stopped. The thermos was not on the rail where I'd left it. It was on the ground, or nearly. It had been placed, not dropped, at the base of the fence post on the outer side of the fence, the outside, which meant it had been lifted over or through the chain link from where I'd set it on the rail and placed on the ground at the base of the post, on the same side of the fence as the forest. Upright, lid on. The pine cones from the previous night were gone. In their place around the base of the thermos, arranged in a careful radius, were small, flat stones from the creek drainage below the facility. River-smoothed grey stones of the kind that didn't occur naturally in the soil immediately around the fence line. I stood there with my flashlight on that arrangement for a long time. The thermos Darlene had bought was the green one, the dented one, a colour she'd liked, and a dent it had acquired on a camping trip some years before she got sick. It was not a generic station thermos. It was a particular object that I had carried to this particular fence rail for 11 years, first because she'd started the habit, and then because stopping felt like abandonment. And now it was on the other side of the fence in a circle of creek stones, and I did not know how to account for what I was feeling, except that my eyes had gone wet in the cold, and I was not a man who cried easily or often. I raised my flashlight and pointed it toward the tree line without really expecting anything. The shape was there. Not in the hemlock gap this time. Closer to the fence, 15 feet out, standing at the very edge of the security light's cast, where the orange glow from the sodium vapor fixture just reached the nearer trees and gave the outer surface of the darkness a faint, warm edge. It was standing without concealment now, not moving, not hidden, just present. And in the mixed light of my flashlight and the security lamp, I could see that it was very large and covered in dark hair that caught the light at the tips, the way frost does on fur, and it was looking at me. The face was in shadow. The eyes caught my flashlight for one moment, a brief animal gleam, amber or warm brown, and then the head turned slightly, not away but to the side, as though looking at the thermos on the ground and then back at me. And I had the sensation, which I have never been able to explain and have never tried very hard to explain away, that whatever I was looking at had understood the thermos in a way that had nothing to do with it being a container for liquid. Hatch was sitting at my boot. He'd come to my side at some point during my walk from the perimeter's south side, and I hadn't noticed. He was sitting in the same settled way, weight back, chest forward, attentive and calm. He was 11 years old, and he had been on this fence line for 11 years, and he was telling me, with every line of his body, that this was all right. I stood at the fence for a long time. I don't know how long. The cold had gotten into my fingers, and I dropped my hand with the flashlight to my side and was holding the beam on the gravel at my feet, and I was looking at the shape in the near dark. I couldn't see the eyes again after that first reflection, only the general mass and height of it, the way it was standing with a patience that felt ancient and undemanding, not asking anything, not departing, just there the way the trees were there, the way the station had always been there in the dark of the valley. I thought about Darlene, not in the sharp way grief usually arrives. In a softer way, the way she entered my thinking when I was driving at night on a straight stretch of road, or working through a long repair with my hands doing what they knew, and my mind free to go where it needed to. I thought about the thermos on the kitchen counter every morning before I left, and the twice-knocked fence post, and her voice saying I was a night country person, and the particular way she'd had of doing a thing that needed doing, without making a ceremony of it, as though the act was its own reason. And then, because I was a man with a habit of doing what needed doing, I walked to the northwest fence rail and took the thermos cap off and poured a cup of coffee into the lid and set the lid on the rail the way I'd always set it when I stopped to drink on a walk. I stood there and drank it. The shape in the tree line was still there. I could hear my own breathing and the distant sound of the tail race channel 30 yards downhill and nothing else. After a while, without sound, without any movement I registered in real time, the shape was simply no longer where it had been. The tree line was the tree line again. The night was its own cold self. Hatch got up and stretched his back legs one at a time, the way he did when he'd been sitting a while, and looked up at me. I reached down and rested my hand on his head. I went back inside and sat at the panel and did not log what I had seen. I wrote the readings, I checked the head pond level, I ran the automated test sequence on the fault monitoring. At 4 a.m, I went out and retrieved the thermos from the outside of the fence, which required unlatching the access gate at the northwest corner, a gate I never used in the ordinary run of a shift. The creek stones were still arranged around where it had stood. I left them there. I brought the thermos in and rinsed it at the utility sink and refilled it and set it on the corner of the desk, and I sat there looking at it until Ray's headlights came up the grade at 6:10. "Quiet night," Ray said when he came in. "Quiet night," I said. He looked at me for a moment, the kind of look where a man is deciding whether he's owed more, and then he went to the panel and started his takeover checks. I got my jacket, got Hatch's leash, and went out into the morning. I sat in the truck for a while before I started it, long enough to watch the light come up behind the eastern ridge and start to find the tops of the hemlock and fir on the west slope above the station, the cold dawn light going from grey to pale gold in stages. The thermos was in the door pocket. Hatch had his head on my thigh. My phone was in my chest pocket, and I could feel its weight against my sternum. I'd like to say I knew right then what I needed to do, but it wasn't that clean. It was more that the thing I'd been avoiding had gotten lighter in my chest. Not gone, but lighter. The way a familiar piece of equipment feels lighter after you've finally done the maintenance it needed, and the parts are moving freely again. I'd been carrying the silence between me and Clifton the same way I'd been carrying the thermos to the fence rail, not because it was helping, but because stopping felt like the next loss in a line of losses I didn't know how to survive. I took out my phone and found Clifton's number. It rang 3 times and he picked up, and I could hear by the particular caution in his voice that he'd seen my name on the screen and hadn't known what to do with it, the same way I'd scrolled past his for months and hadn't known what to do. "Dad?" he said. "Yeah," I said. There was a pause, the kind that needed to be there. "It's early," he said. "I just came off nights," I said. "I'm sorry for the hour." And then I said, "I'm sorry for the months." He was quiet. I heard him move. Some small sound of shifting, like he'd sat down somewhere. "I wanted to call," he said. "I know," I said. "Me too. I don't have a good reason for not doing it." "Mom would have." "She would have called by February," I said. "She would have called by Christmas and then again in February when I still hadn't." He made a sound that was mostly breath, not quite a laugh. It was Darlene's sound, the small one she made when something was both sad and right at the same time. and hearing it in his voice opened something in my chest that I was not ready for and not in control of. I didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't say anything either. We stayed on the line in the early morning with whatever was between us, and after a while he said, "Can we have dinner? Sometime soon?" "Yeah," I said. "I'd like that." "Me too," he said. We said goodbye with the ordinary words, the ones that don't carry enough weight for what they're carrying, and I sat in the truck for a while longer after he hung up. The morning light had come fully into the tops of the trees. Hatch had shifted position in his sleep, and his paws were hanging off my leg. The thermos was in the door pocket, green and dented, slightly familiar in the new light. I started the engine and drove down the grade. The following spring, on the first shift of May, I parked the truck and got Hatch out of the back seat and went inside to start the log and run the status board. And everything was nominal, and I filled the thermos with the coffee I'd made at home. And at 6:25, I carried it out to the northwest fence rail and set it there. Hatch came with me. He was moving slowly that spring, his hip more trouble than it had been in the fall, the cold having left some stiffness that the warmer months were only partly addressing. He was 12 now, going white across most of his muzzle, and he walked with the careful economy of an old dog that has decided to conserve what he has, rather than waste it on anything that isn't worth the cost. He stopped at the northwest corner and sat down. The trees were in their first green of the year, the hemlock tips pale and tender, the fir putting out its new growth, the draw between the two large hemlocks where I'd first seen something I couldn't explain, now filled with the kind of light that comes with a clear May morning at 2,400 feet, a clean, uncomplicated light that touched everything equally. I set the thermos on the rail. Nothing moved in the trees. Nothing was there, or at least nothing I could see. The birds were loud in the upper branches, kinglets working through the fir tips, a varied thrush somewhere back in the hemlock shadows. The creek was running high with snowmelt, louder than October, the sound of it washing the morning clean. I stood at the fence for a while. I didn't need anything from the trees. I wasn't waiting. I was just there, the way you stand at a particular place because the place has earned your attention, and because standing there costs you nothing and returns more than you can measure. I'd stopped trying to explain what had happened that October. I'd told the story once to Clifton over dinner in December, and he'd listened the whole way through without the skeptical sound I'd feared. And at the end, he'd been quiet for a moment and then said, "She would have loved that." I hadn't known what to say to that, so I'd just nodded, and we'd sat with it together, and that had been the right amount. Some things don't need a category. They need a fence rail and a thermos and enough years of paying attention to recognize care when it comes to the edge of the light and stays. Hatch got up slowly from the gravel, stretched his back legs one at a time, and came to lean against my shin. I rested my hand on his head, and we stood there together. In the morning, the thermos on the rail, the trees full of new light, the creek loud below us, and the day beginning the way days do at the end of a hard season, slowly and without announcement, the same as every other day and not the same at all.